there comes a day when the life you built no longer feels like yours. You wake up in the same bed. You follow the same routines. You talk to the same people. But something fundamental has shifted. You feel like you're wearing a costume that used to fit perfectly, but now restricts every movement. Nothing is technically wrong. Your life looks the same from the outside, but inside, you feel like a stranger, like you're performing a role written for someone you used to be. And you can't figure out when it stopped feeling real. This isn't a crisis. This is transformation. And it's terrifying because transformation requires loss. The loss of the identity you've been carrying, the version of yourself you worked so hard to build and maintain. Jung called this ego shedding, the necessary dissolution that happens during individuation, the psyche's demand that you release who you've been in order to become who you're meant to be. But the ego doesn't surrender easily. It fights. It clings to familiar structures even when those structures no longer serve you. Because the ego's primary function is continuity. It wants to maintain a stable sense of self. And right now, that stability is crumbling. You're not losing yourself. You're outgrowing the version of yourself that got you here. And the psyche is trying to make room for what's trying to emerge. But emergence requires emptiness. It requires letting go of the identity that no longer fits, even when you don't yet know who you'll be without it. This is what makes this moment so disorienting. You're in between, no longer who you were, not yet who you're becoming, suspended in the space where old certainties have dissolved and new ones haven't formed, and that space feels like dying. The psyche builds identity through roles, beliefs, and narratives. These structures give you a sense of who you are. They organize your experience. They tell you what matters, what to pursue, how to behave. But identity isn't fixed. It's a temporary shelter, a psychological structure that serves you for a time and then becomes too small to contain everything you're becoming. When you outgrow that structure, when the identity that once protected you starts to suffocate you, the psyche initiates a process of dissolution. It begins subtly, a vague sense of dissatisfaction, a feeling that something's off, but you can't name what. You're doing all the things you're supposed to do, but none of them feel meaningful anymore. The job that once excited you now feels empty. The relationships that once sustained you now feel draining. The goals you were chasing suddenly seem irrelevant, and you start questioning everything. Who am I? What do I actually want? Why does nothing feel real anymore? This is identity fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from maintaining a self-concept that no longer matches who you're becoming. You're expending enormous energy trying to be someone you've already outgrown. And the psyche won't let that continue indefinitely. Jung understood that the first half of life is about building an ego, establishing yourself in the world, creating an identity that allows you to function, achieve, belong. But the second half of life demands something different. It demands that you question that identity, that you strip away what's false, what's borrowed, what was built to please others or meet expectations. It demands that you find the self beneath the ego, the authentic core that's been waiting under all the roles and performances. But to reach that self, you have to let the ego die. And the ego doesn't go quietly. This isn't happening in abstract psychological theory. This is happening in your actual life. in ways that feel deeply confusing and impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. You're going through your day, making coffee, getting ready for work, the same routine you've done 1,000 times, but something feels wrong. You look at yourself in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back, not physically, but energetically, like you're looking at a character you've been playing, and suddenly you can see the performance. You go to work, you do the tasks, you have the conversations, but you feel like you're watching yourself from the outside, like you're going through motions that belong to someone else. Your friends ask how you're doing, and you say fine, because you don't know how to explain what's happening. How do you tell them that everything looks normal, but you feel like you're dissolving? That the person they think they know doesn't feel real to you anymore? You can't. So you perform the role. You say the things this version of you would say. You make the decisions this version of you would make. But inside, you're screaming, "This isn't me anymore. But I don't know who I am without this." This is the crisis. Not that you're lost, but that you're found. The part of you that's been buried under years of conditioning, expectation, and survival is finally strong enough to make itself known. And it's demanding space. It's demanding expression. It's demanding that you stop living according to scripts written by people who don't know who you actually are. But that demand terrifies you, because those scripts have been keeping you safe, keeping you acceptable, keeping you connected to a life and identity that, while no longer authentic, is at least familiar. And now the psyche is asking you to let that go, to step into the unknown, to become someone you can't yet imagine. Most people, when they reach this point, try to force their way back to the old identity. They double down. They tell themselves they're just going through a phase. They push harder, achieve more, commit deeper to the roles they've been playing. They get busier. They take on more responsibility. They convince themselves that if they just try harder, the feeling will go away. But it doesn't go away. It intensifies, because the psyche won't let you go backward. Once the process of individuation begins, once you've glimpsed the gap between who you are and who you've been pretending to be, you can't unsee it. You can delay the transformation. You can resist it, but you can't stop it. And the longer you resist, the more painful it becomes. You start feeling it everywhere, in your body, in your relationships, in your inability to care about things that used to matter. You feel exhausted all the time, not physically tired, soul tired, tired of maintaining an image, tired of performing, tired of pretending you're someone you're not. Your relationships start to strain, because the people in your life know the old version of you. They're comfortable with that version. They have expectations based on that version. And when you start changing, when you stop showing up the way you always have, they get confused, threatened. They try to pull you back. They remind you of who you've always been, as if that should be enough to make you stay. But it's not enough, because who you've always been is suffocating who you're trying to become. This is where the grief lives, in the realization that growing means leaving people behind, not because you don't love them, but because they're attached to a version of you that you can't be anymore. And you have to choose the old identity and the relationships that depend on it, or the new self that's trying to emerge, even if it means walking away from everything familiar. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, the period where the old self is dying but the new self hasn't been born yet, where you exist in liminal space, unformed, and uncertain. It feels like disintegration, like you're falling apart. And in a way, you are. But you're not breaking. You're breaking open. The structure that's collapsing isn't you. It's the container you built to hold yourself. And it's collapsing because you've outgrown it. What you're experiencing isn't failure, it's expansion. The psyche making room for more of who you actually are. But expansion requires destruction. You can't build a new identity on top of the old one. You have to clear the ground first. This is the insight that changes everything. Identity isn't who you are. It's a story you've been telling about who you are. And stories can be rewritten. The roles you've been playing, they were necessary once. They helped you survive, belong, succeed. But they were never the totality of who you are. They were adaptations, strategies, ways of being in the world that made sense given the circumstances you were in. But circumstances change, you change, and the strategies that once served you become prisons. The moment you realize your old identity no longer fits is the moment the psyche is inviting you to expand beyond it. To stop identifying with the roles and start identifying with the self that exists beneath them. The self that doesn't need to perform, that doesn't need to prove anything, that simply is. But reaching that self requires courage, because it means walking away from everything you've built your sense of security on. It means admitting that the person you've been isn't the person you are, that the life you've created isn't the life you need, that the goals you've been chasing don't actually matter to you. It means disappointing people, confusing them, letting them see that you're not who they thought you were. And it means sitting with the discomfort of not knowing who you are without all the external markers of identity. No job title to hide behind, no role to perform, no story to tell that makes you comprehensible to others. Just you, raw, unformed, real. This terrifies most people because we've been taught that identity is something you build and maintain. That consistency is a virtue, that changing your mind, changing your path, changing who you are is a sign of weakness or instability. But Jung knew better. He understood that the psyche is always moving toward wholeness, and wholeness requires shedding the false self, the version of you that was built to please others, the version that learned to shrink, perform, accommodate, the version that believed your worth was tied to achievement, appearance, or approval. That version served you. It got you here, but it can't take you forward. So what do you do when you realize your old identity no longer fits, but you don't know what comes next? You stop forcing yourself to fit back into it. You stop trying to resurrect the person you were. You stop pretending that if you just work harder or want it more, things will feel right again. They won't, because you've changed, and no amount of effort will change you back. Instead, you create space to not know, space to be undefined, space to exist without a clear sense of who you are. This feels unbearable at first, because we're conditioned to always have an answer to who are you. We're supposed to know. We're supposed to have it figured out. But individuation isn't about figuring it out. It's about letting go of the need to have it figured out. It's about sitting in the uncertainty, allowing yourself to be in transition, trusting that the psyche knows where it's going even when you don't. You start paying attention to what pulls you, not what you think you should want, not what made sense for the old version of you, but what genuinely calls to the part of you that's emerging. Maybe it's different work. Maybe it's different relationships. Maybe it's a completely different way of being in the world. You don't have to know the full picture yet. You just have to take the first step toward what feels authentic, even if it doesn't make logical sense. You start saying no to things that drain you, even if those things are part of your identity, even if people expect you to keep doing them. You start saying yes to things that make you feel alive, even if they're impractical, even if they don't fit the story you've been telling about yourself. You let yourself change, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually through small choices that honor who you're becoming instead of who you've been. And something shifts. The grief starts to transform. The confusion starts to settle. You begin to sense a shape emerging from the chaos. Not a complete picture, but enough to take the next step, enough to trust that you're moving toward something real. This is what it means to move toward the self. Not the ego's version of who you should be, but the authentic core that's been waiting for you to stop performing and start living. It doesn't happen quickly. Individuation is a lifelong process. But once it begins, once you've felt the gap between who you are and who you've been pretending to be, you can't go back. You can only go forward, into the unknown, into the version of yourself that's too big to fit into the old containers. And that's terrifying, but it's also liberating, because for the first time, you're not building an identity based on what's expected or acceptable. You're discovering who you actually are beneath all the layers you've been wearing. And that person is worth meeting. The relationships that can hold this new version of you will remain. The ones that can't will fall away. And that's not a loss. It's clarity. The work that aligns with this new version of you will reveal itself. The work that doesn't will lose its grip on you. And that's not failure. It's redirection. The life that fits who you're becoming will start to take shape, not overnight, but gradually as you make choices from your authentic center instead of your constructed identity. Jung believed that the second half of life is about becoming who you were always meant to be, about stripping away what's false and reclaiming what's real. But that process requires death, the death of the ego self that's been running your life, the death of the identity that kept you safe but kept you small. And on the other side of that death is something you can't imagine yet. A version of yourself that's more whole, more real, more alive. But you can only get there by letting go of the version who got you here. Growth asks you to release the version of you who survived the past.